So, part three of our Elements of Handicapping series for the Kentucky Derby is speed. It's the record and evaluation of each contender's speed figures in comparison to the field and Kentucky Derby pars. So, our speed assessment factors, we will compare each contender's speed figures against the field average to assess competitiveness utilizing the following benchmarks. So, we're going to use the Buyer's speed figures, the Brisnet speed figures, and then we'll use the Thorograph as well. Then we'll have an evaluation based upon potential progression or regression. And for the part one, what we're going to do is we'll add and subtract from the speed pars each contender's last race speed figure to determine how he compares to the field. So what we're going to do is all the contenders, their last race, whatever their speed figure is, Buyer, Thorograph, Brisnet, we will subtract it from the speed par. And what that is the average of all the contenders' last races' speed figures. And from that, we'll get the difference, positive or negative. And so we've done the averages. Some of the Buyer speed figures for all the contenders is 92.56. For the Brisnet speed figures, it's 95.83. And the Thorograph is 3.96. And those of you who are familiar with Thorograph know the lower the number, the better it is. And obviously a negative number is very good, and you probably have a pretty good approximation who got one of those. So part two of our speed rating system is what we've been using for form and class. It's our +2, -2 type of system. So if a horse is really fast, he's a +2. He's above average speed, it's a +1. If he runs about average to the Derby field, it's a 0. Below average, -1. And then if he's just flat out slow, it's a -2. So part three is we will then assess the level of progression or regression. We talked about this for each contender heading into the Kentucky Derby. And again, that's +2 to -2. +2, he's going to run a big race, we think. +1, he's probably going to move forward. Average is he's going to run about the same as he's been running. Regression is he's going to take a step back, and then a flat-out bounce means he's going to come off of what usually is a really big race. So that's our total speed assessment is. We're going to add part one, part two, and part three. So the first is the plus or minus against the average for the field. Then we'll take our general rating and then our progression plus or minus, and that will give us a total speed score for each contender. So we'll go through them individually, and we'll start with Fierceness, and I'm sure this is the one most everybody's interested in taking a look at. And we're going to look at the Florida Derby, and we'll see his Buyer speed figure was a 110. His Brisnet was a 106, and he had a 3.5 negative Thorograph. And again, those of you who aren't familiar, that's an outstanding number. The lower the number, the better. So anytime you see a low number for Thorograph, it means he ran a pretty good race, and 3.5 negative is clear, far and away, the best number in this field. So for the over-under, you saw the averages, and doing our calculations, he was 17.44 above average for the Buyer, 10.17 above average for the Brisnet, and 7.46 above average for the Thorograph. And obviously that number comes from the fact that the Thorograph is a 3.96, and so the negative number is actually well above average, and that's how you come up with a positive there for anybody who's a little confused. Based upon those numbers, we've given a general rating of +2. Fierceness is fast. We know this. Progression-wise, however, that was a big race, and we do know about the good race, bad race pattern with Fierceness, and that was such a big effort. Considering he's consistently regressed off of those big efforts, you'd have to believe he's ready for a bounce. So even subtracting 2 from that, his total score is 35.07. So now we'll look at Sierra Leone and the Bluegrass Stakes, and we see he got a 98 Buyer, which is above average, 5.44. He got a 101 Brisnet, that's also above average, 5.17, and a 1.5 Thorograph number, which is 2.46 above average. So his pattern indicates that he's sitting on a big race. So he certainly gets a +2 as a general rating, because those are some of the higher numbers in our in the field, and they're certainly above average. And he gets a +2 because, again, I think he's going to run a big race for a total score of 17.07. And note, it's a market drop-off from Fierceness. But again, Fierceness ran that huge Florida Derby. So everybody else, just on speed, if that's all we were considering, Fierceness would have to be the one to pick. But again, I think he's going to regress from that. So Fierceness ran a solid. In comparison to the others, 17.07 is a pretty good score. Catching Freedom is our next one, and we'll look at the Louisiana Derby. And you see he ran a 97 Beyer. He got a 100 Brisnet and a 4.75 Thorograph, which is frankly a little lower than I thought, meaning I thought it would be a lower number. So it's actually higher than I expected. But Thorograph takes into account a lot of different things, the surface, the kind of day it was, the wind. It's very comprehensive, and it's a very consistent number over other tracks. So it's very important to pay attention to it. And it is a little alarming to find a 4.75 when you see a 97 Beyer, which only considers the final time of the race, and the Brisnet, which incorporates pace. So just something to think about. From these numbers, you see Catching Freedom is above average for both the Beyer speed and the Brisnet, but he is below average by 0.79 from the Thorograph. So that's a little something, a little chink in the armor there, if you will. He's still very fast, so he gets a +2, and I think he is ready to run another big race. And so I like Catching Freedom here. So a +2 for an 11.82. We take a look at Anna Marie, another one coming from the Louisiana Derby. I thought ran a comparable race to Catching Freedom. He got a 96 Beyer, just a hair below, 99 Brisnet, just a hair below, and he gets a 5.5 Thorograph, which again is higher than I expected. So it does give you some wonder about the Louisiana Derby, maybe in comparison to some of the other prep races from a speed basis. He's still very fast. He gets a +2. He's above average with his numbers, except for the Thorograph, which is below average of -154. I think this horse, third off the layoff, is sitting on a big race, so he gets a +2. So his total score is a 9.07. Forever Young, the Japanese, these are only approximations we can give because there is no Brisnet number, and the Thorograph we do have, which is a 1, which is an outstanding number, but I can't give a score because we don't have a firm Brisnet or Beyer speed figure. I have heard Randy Moss say they're thinking the UA Derby was about a 101, but again, I cannot confirm it, so these are just guesstimates on my part. An 844 above par is actually, would be outstanding. And the Thorograph is above average too. And that really, I think, is a very important number. So from that perspective, I think Forever Young probably ranks up amongst the speed, the fastest horses in this race. And I think he is going to run a good race. He's done nothing else. And I expect he's going to run another good one. So, you can't approximate his score, but I think Forever Young is one that we certainly have to consider from a speed basis. Stronghold has been running in kind of subpar competition, and consequently his speed figures reflect that. He got an 89 Beyer, which is below average. His Brisnet, though, was above average. So, and that'll happen sometimes. That again, because the Beyer speed figure only incorporates the final time, and Brisnet is more comprehensive when it comes to incorporating pace and whatnot. You see, the Thorograph is about the same as Catching Freedom or Anna Marie, which is a little encouraging to a degree, but it is below average. So this is an interesting skew here. You have he's below average Beyer speed, above average Brisnet, below average Thorograph. So where does that put him? I think Stronghold is got a pattern that he's going to run a better race, but will it be fast enough? Probably not. A total score of 3.07 puts him at about average, maybe a hair above. And it's rather dubious to think that he can run a number that'll get him up into the top echelon of Derby contenders. But he is a horse that I think can get underneath, and his speed figures reflect a horse that, moving forward, maybe he's one to consider at pretty good odds. So we'll take a look now at resilience, and we'll see that we're going to look at the Wood Memorial. This is a strange race to me. Normally, in years past, always the buyers from Aqueduct were a little strange. There were some really monster numbers. I remember I Want Revenge got a 114, Achilles of Troy got like a 116, and for a while there, the buyers were really questionable coming out of Aqueduct. But this time, to me, it's the 90 seems about right for the Wood Memorial, but the Brisnet is a 104. So, and that again incorporates pace and a number of other things. And I've always considered Brisnet to be a more accurate number, but the buyer only considering the final time. The Thorograph is a 4.0. That looks like about right. And it obviously it is. So we look at the numbers and you see Resilience is a little bit below the buyer par, but he's significantly above the Brisnet par, and then he's below the Thorograph par by a hair. So this is a horse who's just a hair above, a little bit above average, so he gets a +1. And this is a horse I think can move forward with a +1. I'm not overly certain he's going to run a monster race, but I think he's one that is trending upward, and he'll need to get a little faster, I think, to factor in this race. But he's certainly one to consider, and he's a little bit above the average in the field. So now we'll look at Dornoch, and we'll look at the Bluegrass Stakes. And that race, I didn't like how he ran in it from a form or perspective or class-wise. But from a speed perspective, he got a 96 buyer, which is pretty good, and right in line with some of the better horses. A 94 Brisnet, 6.25 or 6 1/4 Thorograph really won't cut it. That's a little low. So you see, he's a little bit above average for the buyer, a little bit below average for the Brisnet and the Thorograph. That to me is probably more, I would lean more towards either one of them. So that kind of puts him right a bit, I'm going to give him a little bit above average because this horse does have some talent. He's just got a lot of issues though. Progression-wise, from the Thorograph perspective, he does have a pattern that suggests he'd move forward. I am not going to give him a +2 because there's too many other things to worry about with Dornoch. But it is possible from a speed perspective only that he can move forward. So he gets a 1.32, which would put him right at the Mendoza line and just a hair above average in the field. Track Phantom is another one who's been a model of consistency, and we'll look at the Louisiana Derby. And you see you got a 94 buyer, which is about average, a little bit above. 97 Brisnet, which is right about on line. And then a 7 Thorograph, which kind of indicates is probably to me a better number to gauge Track Phantom, seeing as how we backed up in the Louisiana Derby and where distance might be a question. And you see the Thorograph is significantly below the average of the field. I'm not expecting Track Phantom to run a big race, so I don't think the likelihood of progression is that strong. But he is pretty consistent. He always seems to run his race. I just don't think it's going to be good enough. And with a -143, he's at about average for the field, just a hair below it. So he's right on borderline. Just a touch, we'll take a look at the Bluegrass Stakes. And you see you got a 96 buyer attending a hot pace and still had enough for second. Ran really big. Got a 100 Brisnet and a 2.5 Thorograph. And that's like the third 2.5 in a row for this horse. And that's a really good pattern because it does indicate that he's sitting on a big race to come. It may be one away, but I think he's moving in the right direction. He's 3.44 above average on the buyer scale, 4.17 above for the Brisnet, and he's above average for the Thorograph. And that's the one, when you get into those 2s and 1s and 0s and negative numbers, then you're talking about a fast horse, and that's how he gets a +2. Progression-wise, only thing I'm worried about is it was a really big race in the Bluegrass last time. But I think he does have a pattern where he can move forward. I just wonder if that maybe took a little bit out of him. but he gets a very good score at 12.07. So he's clearly one of the faster horses in this race. Just Steel has done a lot of running. We'll look at the Arkansas Derby, and this was his best race of the year. Gets a 95 Beyer, 97 Brisnet, and a 1 on the Thorograph. So he ran huge. So he's 2.44 above the Beyer, 1.7 above the Brisnet, and 2.96 above the Thorograph. So that was a really big race. Now, the problem you have is that those are certainly all above average numbers. So he gets a +1. But if you look at Just Steel's pattern, he has regressed after all his big efforts. And you'd have to believe that the Derby being a longer distance and a much more competitive field, that's a pretty good likelihood. Now, I'm not going to give him a -2 because I think this horse has some talent, and maybe with some time. I mean, he fooled me in the Arkansas Derby. Maybe he will again. But I think it's a little on the dubious side. Still, he gets a pretty good score because I think he's an above-average contender in this race from a speed perspective. West Saratoga, now we're going to see the other end of the perspective here. You see, the Jeff Ruby, he got an 85. That's not going to cut it. He got an 87 Brisnet. That's not going to cut it. And a 7 Thorograph. So he's below average in all three. That's a -2 without question. He does have a pattern where he can move forward. The last couple races, I think he was competitive. He's just not fast enough. That's really what it comes down to. Now, he's a horse that because he may be ready to run a better race than he has, if they take him back, he's a horse you think about sucking up at big odds. And that's really the only thing he has going for him is that he may run better. It's not going to be good enough to win the Derby. There's no question about it. And from a speed perspective, he would be a pretty easy toss. But it's just something to keep in the back of the mind. When you're looking for horses to get up and forth for your superfecta, West Saratoga might be one of them, but certainly not from a speed perspective. Domestic product, we saw in the 2 Florida races, 2 of the weaker Derby preps, and I think his numbers bear that out. He got an 82 in the Tampa Derby. It's just not going to cut it at all. The Brisnet 84, not good enough, and a Thorograph of 7 1/4, which was below average. He is by practical joke. We all know about the limitations there, so he's too slow to win the Derby. And I don't think he's setting up for a good race, particularly at the longer distances. So he has the lowest score, I believe, in the field at -29.68. Mystic Dan is a rather interesting one because we've seen flashes of him in the past, albeit probably aided by the mud in the Southwest. But in the Arkansas Derby, he came back and ran a decent race that maybe validated it, the Southwest, a little bit. He got an 89 Beyer. That's not fast enough. But a 92 Brisnet is not fast enough. But a Thorograph of 3.5 isn't bad. It's a little bit above average. So this horse has shown speed in the past, and I think he's poised to run a better race. However, the problem is he's by Golden Sense. At 1.25 miles, I think it's a little dubious to expect that he's going to be able to run big under a distance I don't think he wants. But he is going to probably progress a little bit. He gets a -1 because a -593, it's below average. And so I tend to believe the Arkansas Derbies are probably a better representation than the Southwest Stakes. So Mystic Dan is a horse that I'm probably, from a speed perspective, and really every other place I'd probably toss. Society Man is one that, he's been on an upward progression. The Wood Memorial represented a very big improvement, but he only got an 87 Beyer, but Brisnet a 102. So, I mean, that's a outstanding race. I mean, that's a very competitive race in here. And Thorograph 4 1/4, a little bit below average. So from a Beyer perspective, he's well under par, but in the others, not too bad. So this is a horse, again, I mentioned, he's one I think can keep running, has the pedigree to get 1.25 miles. I don't think he's fast enough to win the Derby, but again, one you want to think about underneath in the Super or the Tri. And with a total score of 1.32, he's a little bit above average, and if he can take another move forward, that gives him a better chance to finish in the gimmicks. Now we come to Encino, and I've liked this horse since the Battaglia. I just really like the way he's going, and I'm sorry, that should be the Lexington instead of the Bluegrass, but you all know that. You see in the Lexington, he got a 94 Beyer, a 95 Brisnet, but a 2.5 Thorograph, and that represents a move forward. And so if you look at his numbers, he's right about a little bit above average, and I think the big key to Encino is that I think this one's sitting on a big race. He's in that type of progression, and that's why he gets a +2. Speed for now, he's a +1, but I think this horse can take another step forward. His score does represent above average, and it does put him in the upper echelon, but I think he can go even farther than that. So Encino certainly one to watch, and from a speed perspective, he's certainly one to consider. Grand Mo the First has been running in Florida, and we've belabored how mediocre those races were. The Florida Derby, he did get an 87, but that's below average. Brisnet, 88, below average, and the Thorograph, a 6, below average. He's just not fast enough. That's the bottom line. However, he does have a pattern that says he'll move forward. A better race from him isn't going to be near good enough, and I just don't like Grand Mo the First in this race at all. So I'm with a -16.43. To me, from a speed perspective, easy toss. Catalytic, we only have the Florida Derby to consider, and he ran a monster in that one for sure. Got a 90 Beyer, 90 Brisnet, and a 3 1/4 Thorograph, which is the most encouraging one. The Beyer and the Brisnet are below average for the field, and really more than anything is that while the Thorograph is a pretty good number, I think this horse ran so big in that race, I just can't see him coming back and doing that again. And I think his pattern suggests a bounce, and I tend to agree. I think a -2 for progression, and then he's a -2 for speed because I don't think he's going to move forward. The numbers would probably put him at like a 0 or maybe a -1, but I'm giving him a -2 because I don't think he can move forward from that. So he gets a -968 and probably a toss. Tio Password is another Japanese horse, and I'm sorry, we don't have any numbers at all, so I can't even approximate. However, I will say, watching that race, the Fukurio, where he was begging for the finish in what was probably not that great a field, and the final time was 1.1 minute 54, which is extremely slow for a distance that was probably close to 1 1/8 miles. He's bred to run all day, but I just don't think I just haven't seen any hints that he's near fast enough. That's just my interpretation. But if we can get numbers, we'll try to pass them on to you. But right now, I don't have anything to reference. I'm sorry. So now we come to Endlessly, and this is an interesting horse because he's trying dirt for the first time. And he ran in the Jeff Ruby on synthetic, got a 91 Beyer, 91 Brisnet, and a 6 Thorograph. Generally, his numbers don't indicate a horse who's he's below average in all the categories. He's a nice horse. I like Endlessly on turf. On dirt, I think he can run on it, but he doesn't really suggest a pattern, especially doing something for the first time, dirt, in the Kentucky Derby, no less. I can't see signs of progression there, and I think he's a pretty good horse, but, usually horses run better Brisnet or Beyer numbers on turf than they do on dirt. And so is it logical to expect that he's going to run a better race on dirt? I don't think so. So a -10.43. And while he's a really nice horse, and I like him, I can't use him under those circumstances, and particularly when it's borne out by the speed numbers. So that's the field, and these are the rankings, and you can see Fierceness is clear and away, speed-wise, the best horse in this race. And we all knew that, right? I mean, there's no surprise. There were a couple that were a little surprising. Resilience, thought wouldn't be quite as high. I also thought Catching Freedom would be higher. And Just a Touch, I thought would be lower. So the numbers have borne out some interesting developments speed-wise, for this field. I've drawn a line under Society Man to sort of give you the Mendoza line because after him, it really tails off significantly. Those Brisnet numbers for the Wood Memorial were very surprising to me. They really were. I did not expect a 104 for Resilience or a 100. I mean, that puts him right up running a race tantamount to Sierra Leone, pretty much. So, but they know how to calculate their numbers better than I do, and I'm certainly not going to question the validity. But they were very interesting compared to the Beyer speed numbers. So maybe I think that's helpful in gauging what to do with Resilience and Society Man in this race, because on the Beyers, I might tend to toss, so I think that. While this is our first time using this rating system, I think it was a pretty good gauge, and I think it came out just about the way I expected. Certainly, if you have any suggestions, I'm more than willing to listen. But I think, based on these numbers, that I think it's a pretty good indication of speed. So that's our part 3. We will have part 4. Pace, you've already seen, if you've watched some of the contender profile postings, you've already seen some pace numbers. So you have a pretty good idea about that. We'll put them all together and see how they compare against each other. And then we'll have our final assessment. We'll probably put that out right after the post positions are drawn on Saturday night. So be on the lookout for those postings. And we'll have Oaks coverage as well coming up. So a lot in store. And I hope this helps you with your own analysis.